Welcome to the Mystery and Horror channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. The Forgotten Asylum. I had always been drawn to abandoned places. The idea of exploring places left untouched by time and human hands fascinated me. So when I heard about the abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, I knew I had to go. My friends and I gathered our gear, flashlights, cameras, and a healthy amount of skepticism, and made our way out there, excited for an adventure, unaware of the nightmare that awaited. The asylum had been built over a century ago and had housed the mentally ill until it was abruptly shut down. The stories surrounding it were chilling. Locals said the patients had been abandoned when the place was decommissioned, left to die in unspeakable conditions. Some said the spirits of those patients never left, roaming the dark halls, forever trapped in their suffering. As we stood outside the rusted gates, the atmosphere was thick with unease. The building loomed before us, its windows boarded up, its walls weathered and crumbling. My heart was racing, not out of fear, but because of the excitement that came with stepping into something forbidden. But as I stepped through the broken gates, I noticed the air seemed colder, heavier. A chill crept down my spine, and I wondered if I should have stayed home. The front doors creaked as we pushed them open, and the smell of decay hit us. It was as if the building had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to come and disturb its peace. We turned on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the thick dust that filled the air. Everything was still, untouched by time, but everything seemed wrong, as though we weren't supposed to be there. The hallway stretched out in front of us, dark and claustrophobic. Old medical equipment, rusted and broken, littered the floor. What little furniture was left had long since been destroyed or rotted away. The walls were covered in peeling paint, the remnants of the asylum's former life. And then there were the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the more we walked, the more I realized the whispers were following us, rising and falling with the creaks of the floorboards beneath our feet. As we reached the end of the hallway, a door on the left caught my attention. It was slightly ajar, as though inviting us in. Without thinking, I pushed it open. The room inside was much darker than the others, the air damp and cold. A rusted iron bed stood in the center, its frame bent and warped, as if something had been thrown onto it with great force. But it wasn't the bed that caught my attention, it was the walls. They were covered in strange symbols, hastily scrawled, as if someone had been desperate to leave a message. Then I saw it, a figure. At first, I thought it was one of my friends standing in the corner, but the figure was too still, too lifeless. I stepped forward, my heart pounding. As I drew closer, the figure moved. Slowly, it turned toward me. It was a man, pale, gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I stepped back in terror, but my friends were already by my side, looking at me with confusion. "Who was that?" my friend Jack asked, his voice trembling. I don't know," I stammered. But as we turned to leave, we saw something that made our blood run cold. The door we had entered through was now locked, the doorknob twisted and bent in a way that defied logic. The whispers began again, louder now, and from every direction. We ran, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the asylum itself was moving, reshaping to trap us inside. With every step we took, the air grew heavier, the shadows darker. I could hear the footsteps of someone, or something, following us, always just behind. We finally found our way to an exit, but when we stepped outside, it felt like the world had changed. The asylum, which had seemed so distant before, now felt so much closer. The whispers followed us, echoing in our ears as we ran toward the car. When we finally reached it, I looked back one last time at the asylum. A figure stood in the window watching us, waiting. It was a long drive back, and we didn't speak a word. I couldn't get the image of the figure out of my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes, unblinking, staring at me. I haven't been back to that asylum, but I still hear the whispers at night, soft and distant, like they're calling me back to that place. Story 2. The Hollow Manor. I've never been one to shy away from abandoned places. So when my friend John suggested we visit the Hollow Manor, a mansion rumored to be haunted by the spirits of a long-dead family, I didn't hesitate. The place had been abandoned for decades after a tragic fire killed the family that once lived there, but the stories surrounding it were too intriguing to pass up. The mansion sat atop a hill, hidden away from the main roads, surrounded by dense woods. It was a grand, Gothic structure with high, arched windows and a sagging roof. The moment we set foot on the grounds, the air felt different, thick, heavy, as if the very land itself was holding its breath. The mansion seemed to loom over us, casting a long shadow as the sun began to set. We made our way inside, the front door creaking as it swung open. The interior was even more unsettling. The air was cold, and the faint scent of smoke lingered, as if the fire that had destroyed the place hadn't quite finished burning. The floorboards were warped and creaked under our feet, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the once grand decor now long faded. We wandered through the manor, exploring room after room. There were remnants of a once opulent life, cracked mirrors, ornate furniture covered in dust, and portraits of the family that once lived there, their eyes seeming to follow us as we passed. But the longer we stayed, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. It wasn't until we reached the basement that things started to feel truly wrong. The door was locked, but John, ever the adventurer, managed to break it open. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, the air damp and musty. We reached the bottom, and that's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then it came again, closer this time. We turned on our flashlights, scanning the room, but we saw nothing. But the growl grew louder, more distinct, and then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow darting across the wall. I spun around, but there was nothing there. John called out, "Is anyone there?" His voice echoed in the darkness, but there was no answer. The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. We turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind us. I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. The growl grew into a deafening roar, and suddenly, the walls seemed to close in on us. The floor trembled beneath our feet, and the lights flickered, casting everything in a flickering, eerie glow. Shadows swarmed around us, their forms shifting, moving like tendrils. The room seemed alive, and I could feel the weight of countless eyes watching, waiting. We managed to break the door open, but when we ran back to the main floor, we realized something was terribly wrong. The hallway we had walked down to reach the basement was gone. In its place was a dark, endless stretch of corridor. We ran through the mansion, every door we opened leading to another hallway, another set of stairs. No matter how many turns we took, we could never escape. Eventually, we stumbled upon the front door again, but when we stepped outside, the grounds had changed. The trees had grown taller, the air thicker. The mansion seemed to grow in size, its windows glaring down at us, empty and cold. We ran to the car, but it wouldn't start. The shadows followed us, reaching out, whispering our names. We finally escaped, but as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. To this day, I hear whispers in the dark, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I see the mansion in my mind, looming, waiting for me to return. Story 3, The Endless Path. It had been an hour since we had entered the forest. The trees were so thick that barely any sunlight managed to break through, casting the path in an eerie, dim light. My brother Daniel and I had always been thrill seekers, and when we heard about the Eternity Forest, with its infamous legends of trails that seemingly never end, we couldn't resist. The stories spoke of people entering and getting lost, walking in circles until they simply vanished, never to be heard from again. But we brushed it off. It was just another ghost story, right? We arrived at the forest's edge in the late morning, the sun still shining, but the area around us felt unnervingly quiet. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the forest was waiting for us. We shrugged off the odd feeling and proceeded along the narrow, overgrown trail. After a while, Daniel pointed ahead and said, "This looks like the place." I nodded and adjusted my backpack, looking around. The path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, though the trees now seemed closer, their branches curling inward as if they were trying to envelop us. We continued walking, the silence thickening, and the farther we went, the less we could hear from the outside world. It felt as though the forest had swallowed all sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unsettling stillness. An hour into our walk, we passed a massive fallen tree, and after a few more minutes, we saw it again. The same fallen tree in the same position. I stopped in my tracks. "Wait a minute," I muttered. "Didn't we just pass that tree?" Daniel looked back, his face confused. "No, I don't think so. But let's keep going. It's probably just the way the forest looks." We moved on, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling creeping in. We turned a corner in the trail, and it happened again. That same tree. But this time, something was different. It was as if the forest had subtly changed. The shadows seemed deeper, and the path seemed less clear, more tangled. A strange chill ran down my spine. "Something's off," I said, looking at Daniel, my voice shaking slightly. "Relax," he replied, but even he was starting to look uneasy. "It's just the forest, you know? These things happen." But it was starting to feel different, unreal. We'd been walking for what felt like hours, yet the scenery hadn't changed at all. The trail seemed to loop back on itself, always leading us back to the same spots. We turned around to see if we could find a way out, but the way we had come from seemed different now, like it wasn't the same path we had entered. "I don't like this," I said, a wave of panic rising in my chest. The trees, they're closer than before. Just as I was about to suggest turning back, we heard something. A faint sound, barely audible but unmistakable, a whisper. "Did you hear that?" Daniel asked, his eyes wide. I nodded, my heart racing. It wasn't just a whisper, it was like someone was calling our names, though no one else was supposed to be here. "Daniel," I whispered, "let's go." Now. We turned to head back, but the path had changed again. What had been a clear route was now shrouded in thick, twisted vines. The trees loomed even closer, their branches creaking as though they were alive. "Where's the way out?" Daniel asked, his voice growing more frantic. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. We couldn't understand the words, but they were all around us, coming from every direction. They sounded like they were speaking directly into our minds. I grabbed Daniel's arm. "We have to get out of here now." We ran. I don't even know how long we ran, minutes, hours? The path seemed to stretch endlessly, the whispers growing louder and louder. My heart pounded in my chest as we finally saw something. A clearing, a break in the trees. But as we rushed toward it, something stopped us. The ground beneath our feet seemed to shift. The trees surrounding us moved, almost as if they were alive, bending and groaning with an unnatural force. The clearing was not a way out, it was just another loop. No, this can't be happening," Daniel shouted, trying to push past the trees, but they wouldn't budge. The forest was closing in on us. The voices grew into screams now, inhuman, guttural, and distorted. It felt like the forest itself was angry and we were the prey. I looked around, desperate for any sign of salvation, but the path was gone. The trees had surrounded us, and the sky above had turned an unsettling gray. The air was thick with dread. It was then that I saw it. A figure. Standing just outside the trees, just far enough to stay in the shadow, was a tall, dark figure. Its outline was blurry, indistinct, but I could feel its gaze on us. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I knew it was watching us, waiting. I grabbed Daniel's arm again. "Run. Now." We bolted in the opposite direction, crashing through the brush, ignoring the pain in our legs as we pushed past thorny branches and thick foliage. The screams and whispers echoed in our ears, making it impossible to think. We ran until we could barely breathe, until the world around us felt like it was spinning. And then, the silence returned. We stumbled out of the trees into what seemed like another part of the forest, but it was different. The air was lighter. The trees were thinner. The ground felt solid beneath our feet. We turned around, and the forest we had been in before, the one we had been running through for hours, was gone. Everything was quiet. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to speak, too afraid to move. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs felt like they would give way at any moment. I couldn't believe what we had just experienced. "Do you think it's gone?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I replied. "But I'm never coming back here." We walked in silence back to our car, the last remnants of the forest fading behind us. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had somehow followed us, watching us from the edges of our vision. I haven't been back since. I haven't even thought about going near any forest for fear that the path would find me again. And sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers in the dark, calling my name, reminding me that the forest, is still there. Story 4. The Forgotten Village. The first time I heard about the Forgotten Village was from an old man in the town near where we were staying. He warned me and my friends to stay away from the place. He described it as a village that had vanished off the maps, hidden deep in the woods. They say it's cursed, he said. No one who has ever gone there has come back the same. Naturally, this only piqued our curiosity. It was me, my friend Tom, and Sarah, all of us eager for an adventure. We had come to this part of the world to explore, and when the old man told us about the village, we knew we had to find it. He warned us again, shaking his head as if to discourage us, but we brushed him off, thinking it was just some local superstition. We found the entrance to the path on the outskirts of a dense forest. The trail was poorly marked, with overgrown bushes and tangled roots, making it clear that no one had ventured this way in a long time. It felt as if the forest had intentionally concealed this place, as if it didn't want anyone to find it. The air felt thick and damp, and the trees loomed over us, their branches blocking out much of the light. After walking for several hours, we began to notice something strange. The further we went, the quieter the forest became. There were no birds singing, no animals rustling in the underbrush, just an eerie silence. The only sounds we heard were the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the occasional murmur of the wind. We pressed on, though we couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Eventually we reached a clearing, and there it was, just as the old man had described, the Forgotten Village, or what was left of it. At first glance, it looked like any other abandoned village, broken buildings, crumbled walls, and overgrown with vines and moss. But there was something unsettling about it. The houses were too perfectly arranged, almost too symmetrical. It didn't look like a place that had been abandoned due to natural causes. It looked like it had been forsaken, like it had been erased from history. We walked deeper into the village, our steps muffled by the thick carpet of moss and leaves. It was hard to believe that this place was once home to people. The doors of the houses were ajar, and the windows were boarded up, but there was no sign of human life, no signs of movement, no sounds. As we approached the central square, I noticed an old well. It was strange because, despite the age of the village, the well looked untouched, like it had been maintained. I took a step closer, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something about that well. Something watching us. "Let's keep moving," Sarah said, her voice shaky. She had noticed the strange atmosphere too. But Tom was curious. He peered into the well. "It's just a well, guys. What's the worst that could happen?" Before I could say anything, a gust of wind blew through the village and the atmosphere shifted. The temperature seemed to drop. The air became heavy and thick, and the sky grew darker. We all looked up at the sky, which had gone from clear blue to an ominous shade of gray. We turned to leave, but something stopped us. There, at the far end of the square, was a figure. It was cloaked in shadows, and at first, we thought it was someone else from the town who had come to warn us. But when it stepped forward, we realized it was a tall, thin figure with a dark hood, its face obscured by shadows. It stood motionless, staring at us. "Who are you?" Tom called out, but there was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if it was waiting. Then we heard it. A faint whispering, like voices carried by the wind, barely audible, but it felt like they were calling to us. At first, it was just a whisper, but then it grew louder. The voices seemed to come from the walls of the abandoned houses, from the well, from everywhere around us. I grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to go. Now." But when we turned to leave, the path we had come from was gone. The clearing had changed. The trees had grown thicker, and the village was suddenly enclosed like we were trapped inside. We looked around frantically, but there was no way out. The figure moved toward us slowly, its footsteps unnaturally quiet, like it was gliding over the ground. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were other figures, standing motionless in the doorways of the houses, their faces obscured. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stared. We ran. There was no other choice. We had to get out. As we bolted through the village, the whispers turned into screams, loud and sharp, echoing in the distance. The figures began to move, slowly at first, but then they started to speed up as if they were chasing us. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the ground shift beneath my feet as we stumbled through the village. Finally, we reached the outskirts where the trees opened up, revealing the familiar path we had entered from. The moment we stepped back into the forest, the sound stopped. The whispers, the figures, the oppressive atmosphere, all of it vanished. We ran back to the car, not looking back. When we got to the safety of the car, we all sat in silence for what felt like hours, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. We never spoke about the village again. But when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers, the screaming voices, and the hollow eyes of the figures watching us. And sometimes, when I walk through the woods, I feel like the forgotten village is still out there, waiting for someone to find it again. Story 5. The Old Asylum. I had heard rumors about the Old Asylum for years, tales from locals about its eerie history. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, ever since a fire had gutted much of the building. It was located on the outskirts of town, hidden deep in the woods, and was said to be cursed. According to the stories, the asylum was home to troubled souls who never truly left. Some claimed they could still hear the screams of the patients echoing through the empty halls at night. My friend Alex and I, always drawn to the supernatural, decided to explore the asylum. We had done our fair share of ghost hunting in the past, but this place, with its dark past and chilling reputation, seemed like the ultimate test. The idea of uncovering the truth about the asylum was too tempting to resist. We made our way to the old building just before sunset, the sky dimming with an eerie orange glow. The path was overgrown with thick vines, and the building itself loomed ahead of us like a massive shadow. As we walked closer, I could already sense the unease creeping up my spine. The air was still, almost too still, and there was a strange heaviness in the atmosphere. The asylum was a massive stone structure, its windows shattered and covered with layers of grime and dirt. The once grand entrance was now a gaping hole, the doors long gone. We stepped inside, our flashlights flickering as we took our first steps into the dark, oppressive space. The floor was covered in dust and debris, and the walls were covered in peeling paint, remnants of a time long past. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. As we moved further into the building, I could hear the faintest sounds, distant echoes of something shifting in the dark. I glanced at Alex, who was equally unsettled but still determined to continue. "Let's split up," Alex suggested. "We'll cover more ground that way." Against my better judgment, I agreed, and we went our separate ways. I started with the ground floor, walking slowly through the long, narrow hallways. The place felt abandoned, but there was something unsettling about the silence. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed doors on both sides. Most were boarded up, but one or two were ajar, just enough to peek inside. I hesitated, but curiosity won out, and I pushed the door open to reveal a small, dimly lit room. The room was empty, except for a large, old-fashioned chair in the center, its upholstery torn and stained. It looked like a therapy chair, the kind used to restrain patients. A shiver ran down my spine as I stepped into the room, the air colder than it had been outside. I could almost hear whispers, but when I stopped and listened, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere deeper in the asylum. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the noise, praying that it was Alex making his way through the building. But as I turned the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. At the end of the hallway was a figure, standing motionless in the darkness. It was tall, with broad shoulders, but its face was obscured by shadows. I called out to Alex, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly turned its head toward me, and I felt a chill race through my body. For a moment, everything felt like it was standing still, and then the figure moved, fast, much faster than I could have anticipated. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as it lunged at me. "Alex!" I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the deafening silence. I turned and ran, not looking back. I found Alex in one of the main hallways, his flashlight shaking in his hands. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. I saw something," I panted, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "There was someone, or something, standing in the hall. And then it chased me." "You're just spooked," Alex said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "There's nothing here but ghosts." But I knew what I had seen. Something was wrong with this place, something beyond the stories. and I was sure that whatever it wasn't just a ghost. We continued our exploration, but the further we ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Every corner we turned, every hallway we walked down felt like we were being watched. The air grew colder, the silence more suffocating. And the deeper we went, the more we could hear it, soft, muffled voices, whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. "Alex," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "Do you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale. "It's coming from down there." We followed the sound, our hearts racing in our chests, until we reached the basement door. It was partially open, the hinges creaking ominously. We both hesitated, but we knew we had to see what was down there. The basement was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. As we descended the stairs, the voices grew louder. I could hear them clearly now, whispers, sobs, and even the occasional scream, all overlapping in a cacophony of sound. I shone my flashlight around the basement, and it landed on something that made my blood run cold. There, in the far corner, were rows of old hospital beds, each one occupied by a figure lying motionless, their faces hidden beneath sheets. The beds were arranged in a neat line, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that we weren't alone in that room. I turned to Alex, but before I could say anything, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, my heart in my throat, only to find no one there. The whispers were louder now, the cries more desperate, echoing all around us. We ran. We didn't care about the asylum anymore. We bolted for the exit, our hearts hammering in our chests. As we reached the door, I turned to glance back at the building, and for just a moment I thought I saw something. Someone, standing in the window, staring at us with hollow eyes. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. And even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following us. We never spoke about what happened at the asylum again. But every now and then, when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers, feel the cold touch on my shoulder, and I know something from that place is still out there, waiting. Story 6. The Forgotten Village. It was supposed to be a fun getaway, a little escape from the daily grind. My wife, Clara, and I had decided to visit a small village that we had read about in an old travel guide. The village was tucked away in the hills, known for its quiet beauty and traditional architecture. The brochure claimed that it was a place where time seemed to stand still, and that's exactly what we were looking for. We arrived early in the afternoon. The village was charming, with cobblestone streets and quaint houses, their stone walls covered in ivy. The locals greeted us with warm smiles, and we couldn't help but notice how serene everything seemed. It felt like stepping into a different era. Clara and I were excited to explore, and after checking into the small guest house, we set off down the narrow lanes. The village was small, just a handful of homes and a few old shops. There was a large church at the center, surrounded by a cemetery with weathered gravestones. As we wandered, Clara mentioned that it felt a little eerie, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just her imagination. As the day faded into evening, we decided to grab dinner at a small inn by the edge of the village. The food was delicious, but the innkeeper's manner was odd. He didn't speak much, and when he did, it was almost as if he were avoiding eye contact. Clara noticed it too, and we both exchanged uneasy glances, but we didn't think much of it. After dinner, we decided to take a walk around the village. The sky was already darkening, and a cold mist was rolling in from the hills. It wasn't unusual for fog to settle in the valley at night, but this felt different, unnatural, as if the fog was alive, moving in strange, serpentine patterns. Clara was nervous, but I convinced her to walk with me through the village's main street. It was completely deserted, with no sign of life. The street lamps flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the cobblestones. As we passed the church, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The doors of the church were slightly ajar. I had assumed the church had been closed for the night, but there was a faint light coming from inside, flickering like a candle. Without thinking, I stepped toward the door and pushed it open. The moment I crossed the threshold, an icy draft hit me. The inside was dimly lit by the flickering candlelight, and the air smelled of damp stone and old wood. The church was empty, save for a large, dusty altar at the far end. The flickering light seemed to come from behind the altar. I stepped closer, drawn by a strange compulsion, and as I reached the front, I saw something that made my heart stop. Behind the altar, a stone door stood partially open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. The air around it was thick with an oppressive silence. I looked back at Clara, who stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "We should go," she whispered, her voice trembling. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something was pulling me closer to that door, as if I needed to know what lay beyond it. Clara grabbed my arm, but before I could respond, I heard a faint whisper, so soft I thought it was just the wind. But then it came again, more clearly this time. "Leave this place." The voice was cold, a low murmur that seemed to echo through the church. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively pulled away from the door, taking Clara's hand as I backed toward the exit. We turned to leave, but before we could reach the door, the church bell rang. It wasn't the normal chime. It was deep, reverberating through the stone walls with an unsettling rhythmic cadence. As we stepped out into the street, I felt something change in the atmosphere. The fog was thicker now, curling around the buildings like tendrils. I glanced over at Clara, who looked more frightened than I had ever seen her. "Something's wrong here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave." I agreed, but when we tried to retrace our steps to the guest house, the street seemed unfamiliar. The houses looked the same, but they were wrong. The shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier. It was as though the village had shifted somehow, like we had walked into another version of it, one that didn't quite belong to the world we knew. "Where is everyone?" Clara asked, looking around frantically. "Where are the people? The village should be full of people, but there's no one here." The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant, rhythmic tolling of the church bell. We walked faster, but no matter how many turns we made, we couldn't find our way back. The streets twisted in impossible ways, and the fog seemed to chase us, closing in tighter with every step. I looked at Clara, my mind racing. And then, just as we reached the town square, I saw it. A figure in the fog, standing motionless in the distance. At first, I thought it was one of the villagers, but as we approached, I saw the truth. The figure wasn't human. It was a tall shadow, too dark to make out clearly, but it seemed to hover unnaturally, as if its feet didn't quite touch the ground. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. "We need to run," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. We turned and ran, our footsteps echoing through the empty streets. But no matter how fast we ran, the fog seemed to close in faster, and the figure in the distance grew closer. It was no longer just one figure. More shapes emerged from the mist, standing motionless at the edges of the village, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I could hear whispers now too. Soft voices calling our names, telling us to stop, to come closer. With each step, I felt myself being pulled back toward the heart of the village, toward the church and the stone door. Clara grabbed my arm, her grip tight as we pushed forward. The shadows in the village grew longer, the whispers louder. And then, just as we reached the guest house, the door slammed shut on its own. We were trapped. We spent the night locked inside, too afraid to go outside. The fog lingered, and the whispers never stopped. The next morning, when we finally left, the village was gone. No trace of it remained. Just an empty field, as though the village had never existed. To this day, Clara and I cannot explain what happened. We've tried to go back, but the village isn't there anymore. Some nights, I still hear the whispers calling me back to the village, to the church, to the shadows. It's as if the village is still waiting for us, for me to return. And every night, when the fog rolls in, I can feel it pulling me closer. Story 7. The Abandoned Asylum. The night we decided to explore the old asylum, my friend Jake and I had no idea how deeply we would regret it. We'd heard the rumors for years, whispers about the abandoned mental hospital on the edge of town, a place that had been shut down abruptly, its history shrouded in mystery. Some claimed it was haunted, others said it was cursed. But Jake, ever the skeptic, was determined to prove there was nothing to fear. We arrived late in the evening, just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the decaying structure. The asylum loomed ahead, its windows dark and lifeless, the bricks cracked and weathered by years of neglect. There was something about the place that made the air feel heavier, like the weight of its dark past hung in the air. The gate, once tall and imposing, was rusted and half open. Jake pushed it aside and we made our way toward the entrance. The sounds of the outside world seemed to fade as we stepped inside, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in around us. The asylum was vast, a labyrinth of crumbling halls and empty rooms. "It's just a building, man," Jake muttered, trying to reassure himself as much as me. "Nothing's going to happen." We started to explore, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The walls were stained with age and the floor creaked beneath our feet. The air was musty, filled with the smell of mold and decay. As we walked through the halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every corner we turned, every door we opened, seemed to lead us deeper into the asylum, and yet we couldn't find a way out. The place felt like it had no end. Rooms full of old furniture and rotting paperwork, rooms where the walls had been stripped bare. As we ventured further, the atmosphere grew more oppressive, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of our footsteps echoing down the empty halls. "Let's head up to the 3rd floor," Jake suggested. "I heard there are some really old patient rooms up there. Might find something interesting." I didn't want to go, but I followed him anyway. The stairs were narrow and steep, creaking under our weight. As we reached the 3rd floor, the air felt colder and the darkness seemed to thicken. I could feel my heart begin to race as we stepped into the hallway. The walls on this floor were covered in peeling wallpaper, and some of the rooms still had old, rusted beds inside. But what caught my attention were the strange markings on the walls, symbols and scratches that looked as if they had been made in desperation. "Did you hear that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. The sound of a door creaking open echoed down the hall, followed by the faintest whisper, like a voice calling out from the dark. Jake was unfazed. "It's probably just the wind. Let's keep moving." But something in my gut told me to leave. I wanted to turn back, but Jake was already ahead, walking deeper into the darkness. I hesitated, then reluctantly followed him. We reached the end of the hallway where a large wooden door stood ajar. A faint light flickered from inside. Jake pushed the door open and we stepped into a large, dimly lit room. The room was lined with old filing cabinets, and in the center, there was a desk cluttered with old papers. But it wasn't the room that unsettled me, it was the sound. The low, rhythmic sound of someone, or something, moving around in the dark corner of the room. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice breaking the silence. There was no answer. I felt a chill run down my spine, but Jake took a step forward, ignoring the growing sense of dread. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into total darkness. I grabbed Jake's arm. "Let's get out of here. Now." But before we could leave, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The air grew cold and I could feel something moving in the dark. I swung my flashlight around, and the beam landed on a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a man, but his face was twisted, contorted in agony. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, and his body trembled violently as though it were in the throes of some unseen force. "Jake, we need to go, now," I screamed, tugging at his arm. But Jake didn't move. He was staring at the figure, his expression frozen in shock. I pulled harder and finally he snapped out of his trance. We rushed for the door, but as we reached it, it slammed shut again, trapping us inside. The figure in the corner moved closer, its body jerking unnaturally, dragging its feet across the floor. It was getting closer, too close. I could hear its breath, shallow and ragged, as though it had been waiting for us. "Run!" Jake yelled, and we both bolted toward the back window. We shoved it open and climbed out, our hands shaking as we scrambled down the side of the building. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. I slammed the door shut behind me, and Jake started the engine, speeding away from the asylum as fast as he could. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. The memory of the figure haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for someone else to step inside. When we finally got home, we tried to convince ourselves it was just our imagination. But that night, I heard a soft knock at the door. When I opened it, there was nothing there, just the feeling that someone was watching from the shadows. It's been months since that night, and I still hear that same knocking every now and then. I don't know what happened in that asylum, but I know one thing. Some places are better left forgotten, and I'll never go back to find out. Story 8, The Old Lighthouse. I've never been afraid of the ocean, but after that night, I will never look at it the same way again. My friend Alex and I had heard the rumors about the old lighthouse for years. It stood on a cliff at the edge of town, abandoned and decaying, its light long extinguished. The stories were all the same. The keeper of the lighthouse, a man named Edward, had disappeared without a trace years ago, and ever since, the lighthouse had been said to be haunted. We decided to investigate, of course. It seemed like an adventure, a way to kill time during our summer break. We made plans to go out there on a quiet Saturday evening, just before sunset, thinking we could explore the lighthouse and maybe even get some eerie pictures. As we drove closer, the lighthouse came into view, perched high on a rocky cliff, the waves crashing violently below. The wind howled around us as though the ocean itself was warning us to turn back. The lighthouse was more imposing than I remembered, the tall stone tower cracked and weathered by the years of neglect. The light at the top was dark, and there were no signs of life anywhere around it. The rusted gate creaked as we pushed it open, stepping onto the property. The path leading up to the lighthouse was overgrown with weeds, and the surrounding area seemed eerily quiet. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but Alex laughed it off. "It's just a building, man. No need to get spooked," he said, pushing forward. We walked up the stairs to the lighthouse door. It was surprisingly unlocked, which was unsettling in itself. We pushed it open and stepped inside, the smell of mildew and old wood hitting us immediately. The air inside was thick, stale, and heavy with the smell of salt water that seemed to cling to everything. The ground floor was empty, save for a few broken chairs and some old crates. We could hear the wind howling outside, but inside, it was deathly quiet, as though the place was holding its breath. I felt like we were being watched, but when I turned around, no one was there. "Let's go up," Alex said, already making his way up the rickety wooden staircase that spiraled upwards. I hesitated, feeling a sense of foreboding creeping over me, but I followed him anyway. The higher we went, the darker it became, and the air grew colder. The old lighthouse seemed to creak and groan under the weight of time, and the wind outside made the walls shudder. When we reached the top, the room was dusty, and the broken glass in the windows let in only faint light. The light mechanism was gone, and the place felt abandoned in the truest sense of the word. But then we noticed something odd. In the corner of the room, there was a small table, and on it, a lantern still burning. The flickering flame cast eerie shadows across the room, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing by the window looking out to sea. I froze. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Alex, but when I turned to look, the figure was gone. Alex was unfazed. "You're just imagining things. It's probably just some old caretaker who still comes around." I didn't believe him, though. The chill in the air wasn't just the wind, it felt unnatural. It felt like something was here, something that didn't want us there. I glanced back at the lantern, and that's when I noticed it. Written on the wall, just beneath the window, were words carved into the wood. "Don't look out." I felt a cold rush of fear wash over me, my heart racing. "Alex, we need to leave. Now." But Alex, being Alex, was already moving toward the window, his curiosity overtaking him. "Come on, what's the worst that could happen? It's just a lighthouse." I tried to stop him, but it was too late. He pushed open the window, and the moment he did, I heard something, a sound I'll never forget. It was a low, guttural growl, like the ocean itself was angry. The wind screamed louder, and I felt the ground beneath us tremble. Alex turned back to me, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. It's here," he whispered. I rushed toward him, but as I reached the window, I froze. Out there, on the rocky cliffs, stood a figure, a man in tattered clothes, his back to us. His skin was as pale as the moon, and his hair was wild and unkempt. He stood motionless, staring at the ocean, but there was something deeply wrong about him. His presence seemed to twist the air around him, distorting the light and the shadows. "Alex, we need to get out of here," I urged, but Alex was frozen, unable to move. It was like he was hypnotized. Without thinking, I grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the window. The growling noise intensified, now almost deafening, like the sea was ready to swallow us whole. We rushed down the stairs, but as we reached the bottom, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The room went pitch black. I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel something closing in on us. "Help!" I shouted, but no sound came from my mouth. Then the floor beneath us shifted, groaning as though something massive was moving below. The entire lighthouse seemed to shake. I grabbed Alex's hand and together we pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of something dragging itself toward us from the shadows was growing louder, and I knew it was coming. With a final burst of adrenaline, I kicked the door open and we ran into the night, not stopping until we reached the car. We didn't look back. We drove away in silence, both of us shaken to our core. We never spoke of that night again, but the nightmares still haunt me. Every time I close my eyes, I see that figure standing on the cliff, waiting for me. I don't know what it was or what happened in that lighthouse, but I can't shake the feeling that something was watching us that night. And now, every time I go near the sea, I hear the same growl, distant but ever-present, like the ocean itself is calling me back. And I'm terrified that one day it will get what it wants. Story 9. The Abandoned Hospital. It was a dark and rainy evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old hospital on the outskirts of town. The building had been abandoned for years, but its eerie reputation had been building for decades. Local legend had it that the hospital was home to tragic stories, patients who had died under mysterious circumstances, and staff who had vanished without a trace. Despite the warnings, the temptation to uncover the truth was too great. We drove out there with flashlights, a sense of excitement mixed with unease. As we pulled up, the sight of the crumbling hospital made my stomach drop. The structure loomed before us, a towering figure against the stormy sky. Windows were boarded up, and the once pristine white exterior was now weathered and grimy. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and decay. We gathered our courage and, after making sure we had everything we needed, entered the grounds. The gate creaked loudly as we pushed it open, stepping onto the overgrown lawn. The place felt like it was frozen in time, like the world had moved on but the hospital had stayed behind, untouched. We made our way to the front entrance, and after a few tries, the door opened, revealing a dark, musty interior. The hallway was long and narrow, with peeling wallpaper and the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the silence. Our flashlights flickered in the oppressive darkness as we ventured further inside. The atmosphere felt heavy, as though something was lurking in the shadows, watching us. I could hear my heart beating faster with every step. As we walked down the corridor, we stumbled upon a room that looked like it had once been a waiting area. Broken chairs were scattered around, and old magazines were left untouched on a coffee table. There was a strange smell here, like something had been rotting for years. But it was the walls that caught my attention. Faint, disturbing drawings scrawled in what looked like dried blood. "Do you see that?" my friend Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. I followed her gaze to one of the drawings, a child's handprint smeared across the wall, with a single word written beneath it: "Help." We moved on quickly, our nerves beginning to fray. As we continued to explore, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence was oppressive, but there was something else. An unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach, like we were intruders in a place that didn't want us there. We found our way to the hospital's main ward. The long hallway was lined with patient rooms, most of the doors cracked open, revealing only darkness inside. The walls were covered in grime, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. My flashlight beams swept across the floor, revealing bloodstains that had long since dried, but still told a story. Rachel seemed particularly disturbed by one room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, we all gasped. The room was a child's room, once decorated in cheerful colors, now faded and filthy. But what made it unnerving was the single object in the center of the room. A small bed, still neatly made, with a single red balloon floating above it, as if it had been left there, waiting for its owner to return. Without thinking, I stepped into the room, my footsteps creaking loudly on the floor. I reached for the balloon, but as soon as my fingers brushed it, a cold wind swept through the room, blowing the balloon out of my hand and into the corner. The room seemed to grow colder, and I felt an icy hand graze my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. "Did you feel that?" I gasped. Rachel and the others looked at me, their faces pale. "We need to get out of here," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper. But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. Panic surged through me. The lights flickered and the temperature dropped drastically. Suddenly, a voice, faint but clear, echoed from somewhere deeper in the hospital. It was a child's voice calling my name. "Help me, please." I froze. The voice sounded so real, so desperate, like it was right behind me. I turned around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. "We need to leave. Now," I shouted, and we all scrambled to the door, trying to force it open. The wind howled outside, and the sound of the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Help me." Finally, with one last push, the door opened. We ran out of the room, barely glancing back. As we dashed down the hall, we heard footsteps behind us, slow, deliberate steps, as though someone, or something, was following us. We made our way back to the front door, but as we reached the exit, the door slammed shut in front of us. We screamed in terror, and I pounded on the door with my fists, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. Then the lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The child's voice was now joined by others, murmuring in the blackness, their words unintelligible but full of anguish. I could feel something moving in the dark, brushing against me, but I couldn't see what it was. Suddenly, the door burst open, and we rushed outside into the night, gasping for air. We didn't stop running until we were far away, the hospital looming in the distance, dark and silent. None of us spoke during the drive back. We couldn't. Our minds were too filled with the memories of that place. The voices, the cold, the feeling of being watched. To this day, I can't forget the sound of that child's voice calling for help. And I can't shake the feeling that, somehow, the hospital is still waiting for us to return. I'm never going near that place again. But I know, deep down, that the hospital is always watching, always waiting for the next group of foolish souls to wander in. And I fear that, one day they'll get what they want. Story 10. The Abandoned Theater. It was a cool autumn evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old theater on the edge of town. The building had been abandoned for decades, but the stories surrounding it had always intrigued me. The locals whispered about strange happenings, lights flickering on and off at night, eerie sounds of music and laughter echoing from within, and the occasional figure seen in the windows. Some even said the theater was cursed, and those who entered were never the same afterward. But none of us were believers in ghosts, and we thought the place would be just another adventure. The theater stood alone in the darkened corner of the street, its tall, decrepit structure looming against the fading light. The windows were boarded up, and the grand marquee above the door was barely legible, but you could still make out the faded letters spelling out the name of the theater. A sense of excitement mixed with trepidation ran through us as we approached. After a quick check to ensure no one was around, we found an old back door that creaked open with ease. The air inside was musty, and the thick dust on the floor indicated that no one had set foot inside for a long time. The walls were cracked, the once beautiful red velvet curtains were tattered, and the seats in the auditorium were covered in mold. Yet there was something strangely beautiful about it all, like a relic of a time long past, begging to be remembered. We ventured deeper into the theater, our footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The sound of our voices seemed to be swallowed by the heavy silence, as if the theater itself was holding its breath. We walked past the main stage and into the backstage area. The halls were narrow and twisting, and the further we walked, the more we felt a growing unease. It wasn't just the fact that the building was old, there was something else, something intangible, that made me feel as though we weren't alone. As we passed the long corridor, one of my friends, Sarah, suddenly froze. Her hand went to her mouth and she whispered, "Do you hear that?" At first, I didn't hear anything, but then, faintly, I caught the sound of music. It was distant, but unmistakably the sound of a piano, a slow, haunting tune that seemed to drift through the air. We all stopped, listening intently, but the music stopped as abruptly as it had started. "That's creepy," Mark said, trying to laugh it off, but his voice wavered slightly. We turned a corner, and there, in the dim light, we found the source of the sound, the old piano. It sat in a corner of the stage, its keys slightly yellowed with age. There was no one around it, and yet the lid was open as though someone had been playing just moments ago. We couldn't explain it. The atmosphere felt charged now, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. My stomach twisted with anxiety, but curiosity pulled me closer to the piano. I reached out and touched one of the keys. As my fingers made contact, a faint, cold breeze seemed to blow through the room, though the windows were all sealed. That's when we heard it again. A low, guttural sound like someone was breathing heavily in the dark. It was coming from the auditorium. We rushed back to the main hall, our flashlights sweeping across the seats, but no one was there. The sound of the breathing continued, growing louder, closer. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. For a split second, the whole theater was pitch black. And in that brief moment, we heard it, laughter. The eerie, echoing laughter of a crowd. But when the lights came back on, the auditorium was empty. That's when it hit us. We weren't alone. Suddenly, a door slammed shut at the far end of the hallway. We turned, eyes wide, and began to run toward the exit. But no matter which way we went, the hall seemed to stretch, the doors leading us back to the same spot. Panic set in as we realized the building itself was changing, shifting, trapping us inside. It felt like an eternity before we found our way back to the front door. But when we tried to open it, the door wouldn't budge. We were stuck. The music started again, this time faster, more frantic, and it was joined by the laughter, louder, more insistent. And then we saw them. Figures began to emerge from the shadows at the back of the theater, slowly, methodically, their faces hidden in the darkness. They moved with a deliberate, almost calculated slowness, but there was something unnatural about the way they glided toward us. No one spoke, but we all felt the same cold dread creeping up our spines. "Get out!" Sarah screamed, pulling at the door in a frantic panic, but the door remained locked. We backed away, our breaths shallow, our hearts racing in fear. But the figures kept coming, their laughter now filling every corner of the room, the sound of it ringing in our ears. And just as they were almost upon us, the door finally gave way with a loud creak. We stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath, looking back only to see the theater standing still and silent behind us. We never spoke about it again. Not once. But none of us could forget what happened that night. To this day, I hear that laughter echoing in my mind, the ghostly music still lingering in my ears, and I wonder if, somehow, the theater is still waiting for the next group of curious souls to step inside. And I know deep down it's only a matter of time before it calls us back. But I'll never go near it again. Never. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next terror.